Welcome back to the deep dive. If you are the listener who tracks every nutrient, measures every workout load, and obsesses over achieving that 8 hours of perfect deep sleep, well, we are talking to you today.
Hmm.
We are ripping open a blind spot that Troy Tysera, in his research on health optimization, calls the ultimate silent saboteur, invisible mold.
Yeah, and it's a really compelling argument he makes because, for the hyper-optimized individual, failure or perceived failure
Hmm.
is often attributed to internal factors like maybe dietary slip-ups, stress, or just poor recovery.
Right, you blame yourself first.
Exactly. But Teixeira flips the script. He posits that this microscopic environmental contaminant is actively eroding peak health, leading to chronic brain fog and fatigue that you might be wrongly blaming on the things you think you can control.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the frustration must be immense, right? You're being
Right.
perfectly disciplined, following all the rules, yet you feel run down, you feel off. And the idea here is that you have an unseen opponent in your most intimate environment, your home, and that opponent is systematically undermining every single game you manage to achieve.
Hmm.
So our mission today is to move beyond just, generic panic about mold. We want to understand the mechanism of this threat, define its hidden playgrounds, and really arm you with the technical defense strategies you need.
Yeah, we have to shift our focus. It's not just about metabolic and behavioral inputs anymore. We need to look at the fundamental quality of the air we breathe and the environment we inhabit day in, day out.
So the big question guiding our deep dive today is this. How can something completely invisible, just floating through the air, generate such a powerful long-term systemic impact that it actually derails physical endurance and cognitive function?
It forces a necessary and, let's be honest, often uncomfortable investigation into the structure we live in. It's not just about the what, but the where.
Okay, let's start right at the source, at the microscopic particle level. Mold spores. When we hear mold, most of us picture the obvious colonies, the fuzzy black or green patch you might find in a damp corner.
The visible stuff.
But Teixeira's focus, and ours today, is on the invisible threat, the actual reproductive mechanism. So what are these spores, functionally speaking?
Well, they are the reproductive engine of the fungus. It's that simple. A mold colony, once it's established, releases these spores into the air, and they effectively act as seeds. Think of them as biological dust.
Biological dust. I like that. How small are we talking?
Typically, they range from maybe 3 to 40 microns in size, but often they can be much smaller, putting them well within the respirable particle range. You can breathe them deep into your lungs.
And this tiny size is really the secret to their stealth, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's key. They don't require a visible colony to contaminate an entire building. All they need is a single, maybe hidden colony producing them somewhere. That's enough.
And the source material emphasizes the physics of this stealthiness. Because they are so incredibly small and have such a low terminal velocity, they don't just fall to the ground quickly like, say, dust bunnies do.
That's exactly right. They achieve suspension. They're light enough to effectively float on just normal ambient air currents, or even the slight thermal currents generated by heating and cooling systems in a house.
So like microscopic balloons almost.
Kinda, yeah. Think of them like extremely fine talcum powder. They can drift through the air for hours, sometimes even days, reaching distant rooms or settling very quietly onto horizontal surfaces without any major visible disruption or, heavy air movement needed.
And this ability to linger means exposure isn't just transient, like walking past something smelly. It's potentially constant.
It's constant, yeah. That's the danger.
Okay, here's where the mechanics of stealth get kind of infrastructural. The spores don't just generate in one place and stay put. They are expert travelers. They use what the source calls hitchhiking vectors to spread the contamination.
They're magnificent opportunists, honestly. They capitalize on pretty much everything, including just human activity. The first vector is dust particles. The ubiquitous particulate matter in indoor air. Spores attach readily to that.
Okay, so dust isn't just dust.
Not always, no.
Yeah.
Secondly, our clothing, our shoes, even our pets are crucial transportation devices.
Right.
They carry spores in from the outdoor environment where mold is naturally abundant, of course.
Right.
Or they track them from one contaminated area, like maybe a damp basement, to a supposedly clean area within the house. You walk into that basement, you wear the spores out on your shoes, your clothes.
But the truly insidious vector, the one that really makes this an infrastructural problem, as Teixeira points out, is the HVAC system. You're heating and cooling.
Oh, absolutely. The HVAC system is basically the primary distribution network in a modern sealed structure. It's like the circulatory system for spores.
How does that work exactly?
Well, If a mold colony establishes itself anywhere in the ductwork, perhaps near a cooling coil that experiences frequent condensation, which is common,
Right, I can picture that.
or maybe if spores are just pulled in through an unsealed intake vent from outside or from a contaminated crawl space, then the forced air system becomes this high-powered spore launcher.
Wow.
It systematically pushes these microscopic particles out through every register, into every room, every single corner of the structure. It ensures passive, widespread, and constant exposure to everyone inside.
Yeah.
It turns a localized air quality problem into a whole house issue.
Okay, so we have the spore, this tiny seed, and we have the delivery system, the HVAC. What sets the stage for the original colony to actually grow and start releasing these particles in the first place? What is the prime environmental condition?
It's pretty straightforward. Mold requires four things. It needs food, it needs oxygen, a suitable temperature, and moisture.
Okay.
Now, the food, things like organic materials, wood, paper, the paper on drywall, gypsum, and oxygen, are usually abundant indoors. Temperature is usually suitable too. We like it comfortable. Therefore, moisture is nearly always the limiting factor. The research is absolutely unambiguous on this. Damp environments, poor ventilation, and high sustained humidity are the prime conditions.
And crucially, as Teixeira emphasizes, you don't need a catastrophic flood, right? It's not just about major water damage.
Not at all. That's a
Yeah.
key misconception. Sustained ambient relative humidity above 60%, which is often easily reached in basements, bathrooms, laundry rooms, or just during rainy seasons in many climates, that's sufficient for many common indoor molds to germinate and begin spore production.
That makes perfect sense. If the air itself is heavy with moisture, you're basically creating an incubator.
You are.
And the key, frankly terrifying insight here is that these particles don't just vanish once the air seems clear. They linger and they settle.
Oh, they exhibit extreme persistence. Once they are airborne and they find a quiescent zone-like, an area with low air movement behind furniture, in closets, they settle. And they embed themselves deeply into porous materials.
Like what?
Well, the synthetic fibers of upholstery, drapery, mattresses. And they are notoriously difficult to remove from the porous paper backing of drywall. That's a big one.
So even if you fix the source.
Exactly. Even after a visible colony is professionally removed, if the cleaning and the air filtering haven't been meticulously comprehensive, the environment can remain contaminated with these settled spores, just waiting to be resuspended by simple actions like walking, vacuuming, or even just dusting.
Wow. So it transforms the home into a chronic exposure site, even if the primary source, the main leak or whatever, has been addressed.
That's the challenge. It becomes a reservoir.
Okay, so if the spore is the invisible saboteur, then moisture is the necessary catalyst. It's the master key, really, that unlocks the colony growth. We need to detail the various ways moisture infiltrates buildings or just becomes trapped indoors, effectively becoming, as the source puts it, mold's love language.
Right. It's all about the water.
What are the most common culprits that feed these colonies, especially the ones that tend to evade just casual visual inspection?
Well, we have to focus on areas where water is present, or residual, and importantly, sustained over time. The classic hidden problem is the small, persistent leak. Think of leaky pipes inside wall cavities. Often it's just a slow drip near a joint, maybe behind the shower or under a sink, which can saturate materials like drywall or the wood framing over weeks or even months.
And because these leaks don't trigger some catastrophic flood.
Right, they go unnoticed. But meanwhile, they're creating a perfectly saturated habitat, completely out of sight, just feeding a growing colony.
It's not just pressurized plumbing, though. The source also points to external infiltration, things like poorly sealed windows or maybe issues with roof flashing that allows rainwater to wick into the building envelope itself.
That external water intrusion is a major factor, definitely, often tied to the age of the building or sometimes just poor construction or maintenance. We also have to look at capillary action.
Explain that.
That's moisture wicking up from the foundation or the basement slab directly into porous materials, like the wooden sill plates at the base of the walls, or maybe the carpet padding sitting on concrete. Concrete itself is porous.
Right.
And then there's the more common issue, maybe, of condensation buildup. In climates with significant temperature differentials, you get warm, moist interior air meeting a cold external wall surface, or maybe a cold water pipe.
Like in winter.
Exactly. That surface reaches its dew point and you get condensation, basically water forming right there. If it's sustained, that surface wetness is enough to initiate colony growth, usually hidden behind furniture or inside cold corners of closets.
And we can't overlook the irony, as the source material points out, of devices we actually use to aid our comfort. Humidifiers get singled out. We use them for dry air relief, but
But if they're misused or poorly maintained, they can become localized mold factories. It's true. If a humidifier's water tank isn't cleaned very regularly, like daily, the biofilm, that slimy layer that forms, is frequently mold or bacteria. And if that unit raises the ambient relative humidity in the room above, say 55 or 60%, without corresponding increases in ventilation to remove that moisture, you are actively driving condensation and creating ideal conditions for mold growth on nearby surfaces, especially textiles like curtains or carpets.
okay. And what about past events? Or just daily habits?
We must consider residual moisture from past events, definitely. Like old flooding incidents that weren't dried out professionally within that critical 48-hour window, or habitually leaving damp towels piled up, or maybe improperly dried laundry sitting in an enclosed space like a closet. Mold spores are literally everywhere. They just need that sustained water activity to germinate and take hold.
Let's talk about the hidden zones then, the specific physical locations within a structure where mold tends to spread invisibly, reinforcing why just looking around isn't a reliable detector. If we actually see mold, we've probably missed the real problem by months or even years.
Yeah, you're reacting late at that point. We need to focus on protected, dark, porous cavities where moisture can become trapped and linger. Behind walls is paramount. The paper on the drywall, fiberglass insulation, the structural lumber itself, they all provide abundant food.
Makes sense.
Underneath carpets and carpet padding is another huge one, especially if the subfloor underneath has ever been damp or experienced deep spills that soak through. The carpet backing itself is often cellulose, a very rich food source for mold.
And we circle back again to the mechanical systems inside air ducts and vents. If condensation builds up within the HVAC system itself.
And you get a spore factory connected directly to your home's air distribution network. It creates this self-perpetuating loop of contamination. Spores circulate, they settle in the ducts, they find these little microenvironments of condensation, they germinate, they grow.
And then the colony releases millions more spores.
Every single time the blower turns on, exactly. And this is where I need to address you, the listener, directly here, echoing the source material. You might live in a highly organized, visibly clean environment. You might be dusting meticulously, organizing your pantry by macro group.
You think you're doing everything right on the surface.
But the source material is really emphatic on this. None of that surface cleanliness matters if there's a hidden, sustained moisture source, a slow leak in the shower basin maybe, or high humidity trapped in the attic insulation that's constantly feeding a colony behind the wall or above the ceiling.
Right. It forces us to accept that mold is fundamentally a structural and environmental problem, not primarily a hygiene problem. Your pristine, visible surfaces are, frankly, irrelevant if the structure itself is compromised by unseen water intrusion.
That's the aha moment, isn't it? Realizing that the enemy isn't dirt, it's trapped water. And if the water is there consistently, the mold is probably growing, releasing airborne toxins and allergens that you are inhaling, potentially 24/7.
Okay, this is probably the section most relevant to our listener. We've established that the enemy is invisible, it's mobile. Now, how does it systematically impact the body, specifically targeting those individuals who are already striving for peak performance? Why is mold exposure such a genuine health blind spot for the disciplined person?
Well, it's really the ultimate case of diagnostic bias, you could say.
Yeah.
People who are focused on fitness and nutrition, they're highly trained, almost conditioned, to look for logical, internal causes for their ailments. As Teixeira argues, they attribute these persistent, often low-grade systemic issues to the readily available explanations within their control.
So the fatigue they feel, they attribute that to overtraining, maybe thinking they've pushed into chronic sympathetic nervous system overload from going too hard in the gym.
Exactly. They look at their training journal and they conclude, okay, I just need better recovery. Or maybe it's time for a deload week.
Right. Or they blame the brain fog they're experiencing on poor sleep quality. They're convinced they aren't optimizing their REM cycles correctly, or maybe they just need better blackout shades.
Or maybe they need a new mattress or pillow. Yeah.
And crucially, the diet. If they feel inflamed, kind of puffy or achy, they immediately suspect a food sensitivity. Maybe it's gluten this week, maybe dairy, maybe nightshades.
They assume the problem is metabolic or dietary, maybe something they ate, when the root cause is actually external and environmental. something they're breathing.
So they're fighting an invisible airborne toxin while meticulously running complex elimination diets and tracking every macro. That's frustrating.
It's incredibly frustrating. And what's fascinating and really needs expansion here is why the symptoms of chronic exposure are often so vague and easily dismissed as just modern malaise or burnout.
Yeah.
The source details the core symptoms, which range from the cognitive to the purely physical.
Let's start with the cognitive impact then, that persistent brain fog. People complain about this all the time.
Yeah, and this is often the most frustrating symptom for high-performing individuals because it directly impacts their productivity and focus. Mold-related brain fog isn't just, feeling a bit distracted. It can be a genuine impairment of executive function and processing speed.
How does that happen?
Well, the mycotoxins released by certain molds, which we'll detail more in the next section, can actually act as neurotoxins. They're known to disrupt mitochondrial function, which basically reduces the brain's energy supply at a cellular level. And they can also trigger neuroinflammation.
So it's not just feeling tired, it's an actual chemical assault.
In a sense, yes. It's a chemical attack on the brain's ability to generate energy efficiently and process information quickly. That makes concentration difficult and leads to that feeling of perpetual mental slowness or difficulty finding words sometimes.
Okay. And what about the physical symptoms like that persistent fatigue? How is mold-related fatigue different from just being tired?
Chronic fatigue in this context often stems directly from the body's continuous low-level immune response. Your immune system is constantly battling the inhaled spores and their toxic byproducts day after day.
That sounds exhausting.
It demands enormous metabolic resources. The body is essentially stuck in a low-level, high-demand defensive state, which can often mimic symptoms of adrenal fatigue or chronic fatigue syndrome. No amount of sleep or B vitamin supplementation is going to fix it because the immune system is immediately re-challenged the moment you breathe in your contaminated environment again.
Wow. Okay. We also see the more immediate, sort of localized symptoms listed in the source, like chronic sinus issues and skin irritation.
Right. Chronic sinus congestion, often the kind that's resistant to standard allergy treatments, is a major red flag. Why? Because the spores settle directly on the mucosal membranes of your nasal passages and lungs.
Makes sense.
This leads to chronic inflammation there. Swelling, constant mucus production, that persistent feeling of being stuffed up that isn't just seasonal allergies. And similarly, persistent skin irritation, maybe hives or unexplained rashes, dermatitis. These are common systemic reactions, especially to common airborne molds like Cladosporium.
Yeah.
It indicates a body that's just overloaded by external allergens and toxins.
So if we zoom out and look at the long-term impact, if this exposure isn't identified and stopped, what are the systemic consequences that escalate beyond just discomfort or feeling off?
Well, sustained long-term exposure drives a profound state of chronic inflammation throughout the body. This really is the central mechanism of the health sabotage Teixeira talks about.
And chronic inflammation is linked to almost every major disease.
Exactly. When the body is constantly hypervigilant against these inhaled toxins, it burns through inflammatory mediators and keeps the immune system operating at this heightened stress level indefinitely. This, in turn, often leads to heightened sensitivity to other allergens and environmental triggers. You might become reactive to foods or chemicals that never bothered you before.
So it lowers your threshold for reactivity across the board.
Precisely. Your bucket gets full, so to speak. And for certain genetically sensitive individuals, the outcome can be far more disruptive than just allergies.
What does the research suggest there?
The research, including work Teixeira likely draws upon, highlights that for sensitive or genetically susceptible individuals, mold exposure can directly trigger or significantly exacerbate existing conditions like asthma. Furthermore, the constant immune dysregulation caused by specific mycotoxins can potentially incite autoimmune-like responses in some people.
So we're moving way beyond just being tired or allergic.
Oh yes. It becomes a systemic disruptive force that taxes the entire endocrine system, the immune system, the nervous system. It actively prevents the achievement of robust, optimal health, regardless of how perfect your diet or training discipline is.
This mechanism, then, the direct action of potentially neurotoxic mycotoxins combined with the systemic inflammation from a constant immune challenge, that's the crucial connection that the health-optimized listener really needs to grasp before they blame their next low-energy day solely on their carb intake or sleep score.
Precisely. We need to stop looking only at the fuel we put in our bodies and start looking critically at the air brake that might be constantly applied by our environment.
Moving forward, then, we absolutely need to get specific. When we talk about mold, it's often just this generic catch-all term, right? But the source material is adamant that we have to distinguish between the different types, especially differentiating those that produce potent toxins versus those that primarily act as allergens.
That distinction is absolutely vital, yes. Because while pretty much any mold can cause an allergic reaction if you're sensitive enough, certain molds produce what are called mycotoxins.
Mycotoxins.
Because these are secondary metabolites, basically, toxic chemical byproducts that are fundamentally different from simple allergens like pollen or dust mite debris. These mycotoxins are often neurotoxic, meaning they affect the nervous system, cytotoxic, meaning toxic to cells, or immunosuppressive.
So identifying the specific type moves the conversation from just generic discomfort to understanding a specific toxic exposure.
Exactly. It dictates the urgency and the type of response needed, both medically and environmentally.
Okay, let's break down the big four threats identified in the research, starting with the one that probably instills the most fear in people, Stachybotrys chartarum, the infamous black mold.
Right. Stachybotrys is kind of the poster child for mold toxicity, largely because of the potential severity of the symptoms associated with its specific mycotoxins, particularly a group called trichothecenes.
And where do you typically find this one?
It's found almost exclusively in areas that have experienced sustained long-term water saturation. We're not talking about a little condensation here. Think significant water damage that has persisted for weeks or months. Like behind chronically leaking shower walls, under flood-damaged floors, inside wet drywall from a roof leak. It requires a very high level of moisture, a very high water activity level, to really thrive.
And it looks like its name suggests.
It often forms a thick, greenish-black, sometimes even slimy-looking colony. It's quite distinctive when you see a heavy growth.
What's the specific threat mechanism of Stachybotrys mycotoxins? Why are they considered so bad?
Its toxins are profoundly potent, even at low concentrations. They are known to cause severe respiratory issues, yes, but perhaps more alarming is the potential for significant neurological symptoms, things like disorientation, serious memory issues, concentration problems, and that profound debilitating fatigue.
And why the neurological effects?
Because the trichothecene mycotoxins are known to disrupt DNA and RNA synthesis within cells. They can impair protein production and induce oxidative stress, particularly impacting metabolically active cells like those in the immune system and the central nervous system. So when Stachybotrys is identified, you are definitively dealing with a chemical exposure problem, not just a simple allergy. And this almost always necessitates professional remediation. You can't just wipe it down.
Okay, good to know. Next up, we have Aspergillus. I feel like this name comes up constantly when discussing indoor air quality.
That's because Aspergillus species are ubiquitous. They are incredibly common indoors. You find them readily in general house dust, and as we mentioned earlier, they are notorious inhabitants of HVAC systems, especially near condensation drip pans or inside dirty ductwork.
Where else?
Also very common on damp paper products, cardboard fabrics, even food sometimes. It's highly allergenic, known for causing nasal and respiratory reactions, sneezing, coughing, asthma flare-ups. But importantly, certain species of Aspergillus, like Aspergillus flavus, or Aspergillus ochraceus, can produce mycotoxins, aflatoxins, which are potent liver carcinogens, and ochratoxins, which can be linked to kidney toxicity and immunosuppression with long-term exposure.
And the source also notes it can actually cause lung infections.
Yes, specifically in individuals who are significantly immunocompromised, maybe undergoing chemotherapy, or organ transplant recipients. In those cases, Aspergillus can cause a serious, potentially life-threatening condition called aspergillosis, where the mold actually grows invasively within the lung tissue or sinuses.
But for the generally healthy listener, the primary concern is more the chronic allergy and inflammation.
For most healthy people, yes. The primary concern is chronic allergic rhinitis, sinusitis, asthma exacerbation, and that steady drip of low-level systemic inflammation it causes from constant exposure.
Okay. Moving on to Penicillium. Now, this species is often kind of conflated with its medical application, penicillin the antibiotic, but in the home environment, it's a problem, often found in insulation and carpeting.
Correct. The mold Penicillium is very different from the antibiotic. It thrives on porous building materials like wallpaper, fiberglass insulation, carpets, and even contaminated mattresses that have retained moisture. It often requires a slightly lower saturation level to get started compared to Stachybotrys.
Is there a way to identify it? Like a smell?
Yes, a key distinguishing characteristic that homeowners often notice first with Penicillium is its strong, distinct, musty odor. It's often described as sharp, earthy or damp basement smell that really permeates the air. If you smell that, penicillium is a likely suspect.
And health-wise?
Health-wise, it is a significant trigger for respiratory irritation. Its spores are highly allergenic, and it has a known potential to initiate or significantly exacerbate asthma symptoms in susceptible individuals.
Okay. And finally, the fourth one highlighted is cladosporium. What are its preferred habitats and its primary health impacts?
Cladosporium is frequently the most common type of mold found in both outdoor and indoor air samples. It enters homes very readily from outside. It tends to like natural materials, often found growing on older, damp window frames, wood cabinetry, textiles like cotton or linen, and sometimes even under peeling paint.
What does it look like?
It often manifests as dark green or brownish-black spots, sometimes almost like soot. While generally considered less acutely toxic than stachybotrys, it is extremely common and highly effective at causing surface-level irritation.
So the primary impact is?
Its primary impact tends to be chronic skin irritation rashes, eczema flare-ups plus eye irritation, itchy watery eyes, and throat scratchiness or coughing. It's often the mold behind chronic, low-grade allergic discomfort.
So the expert analysis here really confirms that we need to stop thinking about a generic mold problem and start thinking much more specifically about a potential toxin problem or a persistent allergen problem, depending on what's identified.
Exactly. It dictates the path forward. If testing reveals high levels of Stachybotrys spores or its specific mycotoxins, the response must prioritize potential neurological and internal detoxification support alongside immediate, thorough, professional structural remediation. You have to treat it like a hazardous chemical cleanup.
Whereas if it's high penicillium or aspergillus.
Then the focus might shift more immediately to optimizing the respiratory immune barrier, reducing that chronic systemic inflammation caused by the constant allergic provocation, alongside addressing the moisture source and cleaning up the environment. This specific knowledge, knowing which mold you're dealing with, is absolutely essential for crafting a precise and effective path toward recovery and, for our listeners, renewed performance.
All right, we've established the stealth, the mobility of the spores, the hidden sources of growth, particularly moisture, and the insidious way exposure can mimic other common ailments. Now for the crucial part, the actionable roadmap. For the listener who is already dedicated to optimizing their internal health, how do they start reducing this critical environmental exposure? What are the concrete steps?
The absolute starting point, which cannot be reinforced enough, is fundamental action on moisture control. Since moisture is essentially the food source that allows mold to germinate and grow, eliminating excess moisture is the only sustainable way to stop colony formation. If you don't control the water, you simply cannot control the mold long term.
And we need to move beyond just simple fixes here. The source is clear. We're talking about fixing leaks immediately, no matter how insignificant they might appear. That tiny drip behind the water heater isn't trivial. It can saturate the surrounding drywall and insulation over weeks, turning it into a hidden mold factory.
Precision is absolutely key. You must ensure all sources of external water infiltration, think roof flashing, making sure gutters aren't overflowing back towards the foundation, ensuring window seals are intact, are meticulously maintained. Secondly, utilize high-quality dehumidifiers in any inherently damp, often below-grade areas. Basements and crawl spaces are critical zones here.
What's the target humidity level?
The goal, based on building science research that Texera likely references, is to maintain the relative humidity level consistently below 50%, ideally somewhere between 40% and 50%. Once you get consistently above 60%, many common mold species can germinate quite rapidly.
Okay. And proper ventilation becomes non-negotiable, especially in those high moisture zones like bathrooms and kitchens, where massive amounts of steam and water vapor are generated almost daily.
Correct. And importantly, that ventilation should exhaust the moist air outside the structure, not just recirculate it into the attic or a ceiling cavity, which sometimes happens with cheaper bathroom fans.
Good point.
Post-shower ventilation, for example, should run for at least 20 to 30 minutes after you're done to ensure all that lingering moisture that is condensed on cool surfaces like tiles and mirrors is actually dried out. And high-performance kitchen range hoods, vented outside, are also essential to pull out the steam generated by cooking, which contributes significantly to overall indoor humidity levels.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the maintenance of systems, focusing on the mechanical defenses, since we established earlier that spores love to hitch rides through our home's infrastructure. This is really where the hyper-optimized listener can apply some technical solutions.
Right. We definitely need to talk about HVAC filtration. This is a primary line of defense against airborne spores once they're in the system. Spores are constantly cycling through those ducts, so Merely having a filter isn't enough. You need the right filter.
Meaning?
Meaning you must use filters with a high minimum efficiency reporting value, or MRV rating. Standard cheap fiberglass filters, the ones that are almost see-through, they might be rated MRV 4 to 6. They catch large debris like lint and hair, but they miss most mold spores.
So what MRV rating should people look for?
The general recommendation, balancing filtration efficiency with airflow resistance for most residential systems, is to aim for a MERV 11 to MERV 13 filter. These can effectively capture a significant percentage of particles in the 1 to 3 micron range, which is the size of many common airborne mold spores, without usually putting undue strain on a standard residential HVAC blower motor.
Okay, MRV 11 to 13. Got it. And what about structural choices within the home? The source strongly cautions against using carpeting in any below-grade or perpetually damp area like basements.
Yes, basements are inherently prone to moisture issues, whether from the foundation, humidity, or occasional leaks. Carpeting in a basement acts like a giant sponge. It's also a rich organic food source for mold once any moisture is introduced.
How does it trap moisture?
It can wick moisture up from the concrete slab underneath via capillary action, and then it holds that moisture against the subfloor, creating that ideal, dark, damp, protected habitat for mold growth. Hard, non-porous flooring options like properly sealed concrete, ceramic tile, or maybe luxury vinyl plank are always the safer, non-consumable choice in any environment that's prone to elevated moisture.
Makes sense. Now, what about detection? If someone suspects a hidden mold issue, perhaps based on those chronic, unexplained symptoms we discussed, when do they move from just prevention to active investigation? When is it time to actually test, not just guess?
Suspicion, based on those chronic unexplained symptoms, particularly persistent fatigue, brain fog, respiratory issues, or sinus problems that don't resolve, absolutely mandates investigation. DIY testing kits, the Petri dish kind you can buy, can sometimes confirm the presence of elevated levels of general airborne mold spores, which can be a useful initial indicator.
But there's a catch.
There's a crucial caveat. These DIY kits rarely identify the source of the mold, nor can they typically identify the specific toxic species like stachybotrys that might be growing behind the walls or under the floor. They just tell you spores are present in the air.
So if symptoms persist, professional help is needed.
If symptoms persist, yes, professional inspection and testing are necessary to really get to the root cause.
And what does a professional test actually look like? They aren't just holding up a Petri dish and hoping for the best, right?
Not at all. A qualified mold inspector uses much more advanced techniques. They'll start with a detailed visual inspection and, crucially, moisture mapping, often using tools like thermal imaging cameras or penetrating moisture meters to find hidden water intrusions inside walls or under floors.
Looking for the water source first.
Always. They might use a borescope, which is essentially a tiny camera on a flexible cable, inserted through small, minimally invasive holes to visually inspect the wall cavity or ceiling plenum. For actual sampling, the gold standard involves air sampling, using calibrated pumps and specialized cassettes. This helps determine the concentration and types, genus level, of spores present in the air compared to an outdoor baseline sample.
And surface sampling.
And surface sampling using sterile swabs or special sticky tape lifts taken directly from areas of suspected growth allows a laboratory to identify the specific species present, including potentially toxic ones like stachybotrys, and sometimes even test for the presence of mycotoxins themselves. Hidden mold, especially toxic mold, almost always requires expert remediation because proper removal requires containment, and the physical removal, cleaning, and sometimes replacement of contaminated building materials like drywall or insulation. It's not a DIY job if it's extensive or involves toxic species.
Okay. This brings us back then to the bottom line summary of Troy Teixeira's argument, as presented in the source. This invisible enemy, mold, is far more common than people realize, and it's this opportunistic, stealthy disruptor.
It really is positioned as the ultimate environmental variable that can undermine the pursuit of true wellness. The central, unavoidable argument is that even if you live a hyper-optimized life, you're managing your diet perfectly, your exercise is on point, your recovery protocols are dialed in, invisible mold exposure introduces this constant, potentially overwhelming immune burden and toxic load.
It's a health threat we can't afford to ignore just because the symptoms are vague and the source is hidden.
Exactly. The quality of the air in your immediate environment, your home, your workplace, has to be considered a critical, measurable factor in managing chronic inflammation and achieving optimal health. #Outro.
This has been a really critical deep dive into the hidden world of environmental sabotage by invisible mold. We've covered how these microscopic spores are incredibly mobile, using systems like our own HVAC to spread throughout our home.
Yep.
And we underscored how chronic, sustained moisture, not necessarily a flood, is the singular factor that allows potentially toxic colonies to thrive in hidden zones.
Right. The moisture is key.
And perhaps most importantly for our audience, we've highlighted how the resulting cognitive and physical symptoms, the brain fog, the fatigue, the sinus issues, can directly mimic common fatigue and inflammation issues, potentially tricking even the most dedicated health advocates into blaming their own performance or diet.
Yeah, the mimicry is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah.
So the core takeaway really has to be that optimizing your internal physiological health must be rigorously matched by optimizing your external environment. They go hand in hand.
So we encourage you, our listener, to elevate the importance of your indoor environment, the quality of the air you breathe, literally one breath at a time, to the same level of importance as your diet composition and your training regimen. Environmental vigilance really might be the missing piece of your personal optimization puzzle.
Absolutely. It's time to maybe stop automatically blaming a bad night's sleep or a suspected gluten sensitivity for that chronic sinus irritation or that lingering brain fog, and instead start seriously investigating the structural integrity and, crucially, the humidity levels of the spaces where you spend most of your time.
Makes sense.
And maybe here is a final thought for you to mull over, building on Teixeira's premise. If mold spores truly thrive in moisture, and they are indeed light enough to settle everywhere in your upholstery, embedded in your clothing, deep inside porous building materials, then we must constantly view our home not just as a static structure, but as a dynamic biological environment.
A living environment almost.
In a way, yes. Understanding and actively maintaining optimal low humidity conditions isn't merely about comfort or preventing visible mold patches. It is an essential and frankly non-negotiable component of minimizing chronic systemic inflammation and maintaining the long-term integrity and resilience of your immune system. If you manage the moisture, you help manage the inflammation, and you might finally unlock the true potential of all your other optimized health routines.